Okay, so in this video, we're going to keep going through our Power Platform review. And I think I'm going to call this the deep overview, right? So next in the deep overview would be Power Automate. So let's go ahead and tackle this one. Now, just to be clear, Power Automate, because it can be used in many different scenarios. We're actually going to chunk this video up into smaller chunks. Try to keep these between 17 to 20 minutes, just based on analytics and reporting. I think it makes sense to chunk it up. But we're going to do this, and we're going to make sure that we have a clear beginning and a clear ending. So in this video, we're going to cover the Power Automate workflow engine or workflow scenario. Now, this is actually how it was presented to the market by Microsoft, saying that this is the new way of working. This is the new modern tool set to solve, especially coming from a SharePoint perspective, to solve some of those business application pieces. More importantly, more specifically, to solve the workflow element of a business application build. So in SharePoint on-prem, what we used to do was build these applications using InfoPath for the form, and we talked through that with Power Apps, and then SharePoint Designer, Nintex Workflow, or K2 Workflow, or some other third-party workflow engine that works in the context of SharePoint. And that workflow component is now being replaced with Power Automate. Now, that's just one. And as you can see here, what we are covering in the other videos, there are several other scenarios that Power Automate solves for, and that's why Power Automate is going to be a more robust solution, a more robust tool set than what we are used to, accustomed ever before. Now, when it looks at the workflow engine, let's talk about the workflow scenario. Now, most workflow scenarios are really, really basic, right? So you have your Power App form to where you're going to gather this information, right? And then once you gather that information, your user will click the button. That button will save the data into, in this scenario, probably the most common scenario would be a SharePoint list. Now, again, it does not need to be a SharePoint list, right? We're just doing SharePoint because this is where we're level setting and this is where we're coming from, right? So, this could be SQL, this could be on-prem SQL, it could be Azure SQL, it could be Oracle, it can be, DB2, one of the things that we mentioned before. So it could be anything. It could just be a data source. But now this is where Power Apps ends, right? Let's try that again. This is where Power Apps ends, right? Gathering the data, dropping it into a SharePoint list. And then from there, the trigger would be where Power Automate begins. So you're going to have this trigger. Now, when I say the trigger, that is the thing that initiates or, trigger the workflow. And again, this is something we're accustomed to because most of the other workflow engines have that. They say, okay, what is the action that's going to kick off this workflow? And here you have several options in Power Automate. So you can have when an item is created to a SharePoint list, when an item is updated in the SharePoint list, or you can have it ran on a timer job, not really a timer job, but a timer, a schedule, some type of schedule, right? Or it could be manually clicked on by the user. And what does that look like? Manually clicked by the user. So for each one of these items in the SharePoint list, so for example, we know that you're going to have an item in the list, and then once you hover over that item, you kind of get that menu that expands. A lot of those menu options are going to be out of the box SharePoint list options, right? But under that, you're going to have a Power Automate section to where you can register your Power Automate that says this is going to be a click event by the user, and then they can select that to say send email to client, or they can say something like submit for review, or you can have different actions for the end user to kind of trigger an item, and then that would be like the on-demand or the click button trigger. So you have a lot of flexibility as far as what trips this process. Now, once you kind of get through that, the standard is really, I guess the standard workflow, or I guess characteristics of a workflow is really, really straightforward, right? So usually what you would do is start with submitting a email confirmation, and it does that. And you have many different options with email, right? So we kind of use, I kind of gravitate towards the Office 365 the Outlook. Is it Outlook 365 or Office 365 Outlook? One of the two. But it's the Outlook that's built in, assuming that the user is part of your organization. They have an active account, they have an email address, and then you can fire it there. So this would be dynamic in the sense to where you're going to take the person who created the item, so that way it's dynamic and you're not hard coding anything, and you're going to send them a email confirmation, right? So the user gets an email confirmation, and then based on some type of criteria, you can then notify the next person in the process. And this notification can be, it could be approval requests, or it just could be a simple another email notification. And usually it's who to send this notification to is where we have other requirements, right? So it could be the category selected, assuming this is like a help desk ticketing system, and you select a category. Based on that category, you may have individuals assigned to each category. So based on the selected category, that person would be notified. And there's ways that you can do this. Initially out of the box, I'm going to say initially as a newbie, getting your feet wet, most of the time you will create some type of decision or logic within the Power Automate. Once you mature and kind of get your patterns and practices or better way of doing things, you would notice you would quickly start to gravitate towards configurable lists, right? And we can talk through that, in the future video. But here, you will have, based on a status or a value, right, that's on that SharePoint list item that was collected using the Power App form, you then will make a decision to send a notification or email request to a particular individual. Power Automate handles all of this gracefully, really, really straightforward. And the approval system is actually built in. They actually have an action dedicated to approvals. For the most part, for most scenarios, that's going to be sufficient. There's definitely some scenarios that are really tricky to where you are kind of you may quickly outgrow the out-of-the-box capabilities with approvals, and you start to build your own. And that may sound scary, right? You say, okay, build my own. What does that mean? We're going to go through some of these different patterns and tips and tricks on how do you build a configurable, very robust approval system that may not use the out-of-the-box approval connection. But anyway, the out-of-the-box approval connection is really straightforward. It's either you approve or you deny. And if you approve it, you send them, you do something else. And if you deny it, you do something different. And I say you, I really mean that the person who the request was sent to, right? And then, after these, usually there's some type of communication that will happen that says, notify the requester that it was approved, or again, on the flip side, notify the requester that it was not approved, it was denied. And the fact that, after you get through this decision-making process, you can customize or tailor those different messages based on the action taken. Now, obviously, this is, again, really, really straightforward, very simplistic, basic characteristic. So basically, with the confirmation, the approval piece, there may be like updating the SharePoint, updating the status in the SharePoint list for that particular item, so on and so forth. So these can be, very elaborate, but at the end of the day, once you boil it down, you would just do this same pattern over and over and over again to satisfy different requirements, and you just kind of layer these in. So what does that look like in Power Automate? So in Power Automate, I'm going to take this one. So this is my help desk request flow. And in this flow, you can see this is the standard as you're going to get, right? So here I have, and one of the things that I do, I try to follow this, and anyone that I'm training or teaching this to, this is one of the things that I highly recommend, is that you have the ability to rename or set the name or customize the names for each one of these actions. And this just helps it be more readable. And you can just scan through this very quickly and really kind of get a sense of how this workflow is put together. If you have a step that's failed, you can easily track on what it was trying to do in that step just because you have a quick descriptor on each one of those actions. The other new feature that we have, I would say new, relatively new, probably 3 or 4 months old, is a comment. So you can add, and these are comments to other developers that come behind you. So you can highlight an action, you can add a comment for that particular action, and then that way a developer will say, okay, this is weird, I can't really follow this expression, it's not clear on what you're trying to do here. These comments will help add some light or some insight on what was actually happening here. Outside of that, I want to say these are pretty straightforward. Like I say, I mean, this approval piece, this is the email that gets sent out for the approval. You can do some other things as far as, notifications. So this is, Power Automate also has a mobile app that's in the App Store. It's just like Power Apps. You authenticate with that, using your Office 365 credentials. You have access to it, but that notification would then ping them a notification on mobile as well as send the email notification to that. This is the outcome. This is a static value, right? Sometimes I get tripped up and call this approved or, with a D versus approved. But that you'll quickly find that out because everything else will not trigger. But, if they approve it, yes, execute these actions. And if you expand this out, you can see the email, you can see the tokens to kind of make things dynamic. You can customize the subject line, so on and so forth. So really, really, really straightforward. Now, what makes Power Automate different, right? What makes it different is hitting this plus sign and looking at the different actions, right? Now, I kind of get these mixed up, and I think I have the terminology correct. So what you see here are different connectors, because what Power Automate and Power Apps utilize is the connector framework. And really, this is genius, right? It was genius from a Microsoft ecosystem, but it was probably something that was standard with everyone else in the industry, creating robust platforms similar to this. But basically, that connector framework sits in between the technology and its capabilities and allow you to grow these to other third-party options, right? So look at this one with MailChimp, right? So I said that, I'm using the Outlook connector to send the email, but what if this was a marketing solution and they fill out this form to say, I want to send the client base this form. And then, it goes through an approval process. Obviously, someone's going to vet and make sure the messaging is right, the branding is right, and then make sure the tonality and all this other good stuff is right. But then once they approve it, you're going to have contact lists managed in MailChimp to send this information to. It could be your premium customers or clients. It could be your prospects. It could be, you can categorize these and slice and dice these lists any way you want based on any business criteria, but it's all managed in MailChimp. And what this would do, even though it's a premium connector, it may cost some money to do this, but now after that approval, you can say, okay, send this body email to this list and let MailChimp do the heavy lift, right? And again, these are going to be users outside of your organization, and these lists can be very grand. They can be 1,000 emails on the list. It could be 50,000 emails on the list, and some of these have to be sent in a certain way and throttled and dripped in a certain way, so that way you don't get flagged as spam. You still get flagged as spam. But anyway, but all that's on the onus of MailChimp. They're built from the ground up. That whole company, that's what they specialize in, right? So, but this is the integration piece to make that happen. And that's the piece that is the game changer when you start to compare Power Automate to other workflow engines we had in the past with legacy SharePoint, right? And there's tons. I think there's tons in the tune of, I think we're up to 500 plus, and this is growing every day. So obviously, as you can see, as big as Microsoft is, as big as this ecosystem is, the third parties are motivated to make sure that their component or their application or their service is going to be part of this framework, and that's where the magic happens, right? But yeah, so it's going to be that. The other thing that I've used this workflow engine for, or workflow pattern, is that let's just say, for example, I have this, let me zoom in a little bit. I have this Power App form. They're going to fill it out. Once they hit submit, I'm going to drop that into a SharePoint list. Once I have that data in the SharePoint list, it's going to trigger my Power Automate, right? So once it triggers with Power Automate, the first thing I do is send, again, you guess it, because this is such a common and repeatable pattern, email notification to the requester, just for the system to send us feedback to the requester, say, yep, we got your data, this is processing, and you can probably do some messaging to say, give them expectations of what to expect, what's next in the process. But okay, so now that I go through this notification piece, the next thing I want to do is to generate a Word document, right? Now, this is a little bit tricky. I have a video about how to create a Word document from a template, without with standard connectors, no premium connectors, something like that. But just Google search that, like Word template Deshaun, and it should pop up on YouTube. Now, I go through on how to create this Microsoft Word document based on this SharePoint list data, and this could be a game changer. And that's the thing. You see all those connectors we have access to, and it's really your creativity. One, you got to get familiar what's in the toolbox. So you spend some time playing around and say, oh, what's this? What's this? I'm interested in this. There's a lot of this comes through. I know you want to go through training, and the trainings are really to show you the guardrails, the tools, and the tool set. The magic, though, is understanding what's available, understanding what you can and cannot do. And not only can I use these connectors to create a Word document based on SharePoint list data, and that Word document is not going to be a plain document where I'm just spitting data on a plain page. That's actually going to be a template, a really nice design, marketing spin template with graphics and all this other good stuff. Not dynamic graphics, but a standard graphic, like a logo, the standard graphics that you would have in that template. And then you put in the placeholders of where the dynamic content would go. And this whole process would generate that using the same workflow engine to make that happen. Okay, so you have that going for you. The other thing is, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked with that. So the magic is that you're going to bring the technical muscle, right, and the know-how. Over time, you're going to gain the experience. That's just going to come with time. You just have to be patient, go through that learning curve, some of those growing pains, but stick with it. Be patient. It's not a silly program. It's not stupid. It's just a different way of working. And a lot of this, and I'm going to tell you this, outside of telling you how to get more creative with this, I can tell you this for a fact. A lot of developers and app makers that came from the legacy tool set, the biggest struggle is not the technology. The biggest struggle is you're changing your mindset and going from that prescriptive model with once you look at this and you've been working on this and you look back in 6 months, abusive model, right, to something that's Lego block, modularized, and a framework that allow you to grow, right? And this framework will allow you to grow. We're up to 500 something plus connectors. But the other key thing is, and this is where the Swiss Army knife comes out, is that if you don't find a connector that you're looking for and you need to integrate with a system, and that system has access like APIs or some way to you can dev or custom code against that, you can create a custom connector with the API calls to make that happen, right? So it's really, I almost feel like, once you kind of get into this, you start to feel that level of confidence that there may not be much that I can't solve with these tools, right? You have a gateway to give you access to on-prem. You have a connector framework to allow you to either use what's available to you or build your own in the case that it's not available to you, to where you can actually get a lot done with this. And I think that's the key takeaway, and that's the piece that we're going to cover in the next video. This set of tooling is more than just for power users. It's more than just for app makers or business analysts or someone who's not traditionally in IT but have the technical aptitude to figure this stuff out. It's more than that, because even as a pro developer, and I mentioned this in the very first video in this series, they're gravitating towards this. The ones who kind of get out of their way and stop being, tunnel vision that everything needs to be .NET framework, full stack dev, full stack dev, .NET framework, full stack dev. You have this tool in your organization. This capability comes 9 times out of 10 with your subscription model, right? Because if you have SharePoint and if you have Outlook, you have Microsoft Teams, I think there's only one licensing that has all of that and not this, but all the other ones have Power Apps and Power Automate built in, right? So you have access to this functionality. You should be using it. You should be figuring out a way how to make your area more productive to make that happen. Now, the biggest question is, I don't know what I don't know, right? Deshaun, there's 500 plus connectors. How do I get information on each one of these connectors? Well, when you click on them, each one of these have a see more. I'm sorry, this little information pane, and then you can click to learn more. And then this will drop you into the white paper for that particular connector, right? So this is where you will spend time, right? So, you would come in here, you would spend time. If you're trying to integrate with Workday, you click on the Workday connector and you scan through here to figure out what you can and cannot do. Some of this language and terminology may be foreign initially, but overall, they will all follow the same pattern on how to provide you the information and the capability. The biggest way to learn, though, is to practice, right? So if you have a system, if you have an enterprise solution or something that you want to integrate with, spin up, either get your own site collection at your org, put that request in to where only you have access to it. You're not going to share it out with other people in the org, and you leverage that to practice, right? If you can't pull that off in your organization, because with great power comes great responsibility, and some organizations are putting up the regulatory pieces, the procedures and process, the governance that kind of block you from doing certain things initially, but you can still get access to this by spinning up your own Microsoft 365 developer tenant. So I think if you Google search, let's call this, let's say Office 365. The new name is Microsoft 365. Marketing is really trying to phase out Office 365, but let's see if we can find it with this. So Office 365 developer program. I called it a tenant, but I think it's called a developer program. And then once you do this and you say join now, you give them some basic information. Oh, here's the other thing. I would probably recommend doing this in incognito mode, because one of the things, and we're going to talk through, how do you use browser profiles to separate your accounts for Office 365, because there's a lot of token sharing, there's a lot of cookies and all the other stuff that they're doing to kind of help streamline your login and your credentials, but do it in a safe way. So the browser caches a lot. So when you're trying to switch context and say, I want to do Office 365, but not with my organization credentials, you probably want to do that in incognito mode. Some of us kind of use different browsers, but there's a way that you can create browser profiles and you can separate those credentials using the same browser instance. But that's what you will want to do here. So once you find this site, the developer program for Microsoft 365, make sure you open that up in incognito mode, and then you will go through the registration process. At the end of that registration process, it's going to allow you to have your own tenant, you will be the global admin to this tenant, so you will have access to everything. And I highly, highly recommend this, right? Because sometimes you need to make a request to IT to activate a certain feature or configuration or setting in the admin module, and you can point them to and give them very clear, direct instructions and screenshots where they need to make that change, because everyone won't be on the same page and understanding this is what you need from a Power Platform perspective. You only will know what's behind the covers, especially if you're not an admin, if you have your own dev tenant to do it. So use your dev tenant to, one, understand that what the other world of 365 involves, but also use your dev tenant to practice and get up to speed with, and very familiar and comfortable with a lot of different connectors, and create a lot of sample projects. You saw in my drop down here in my flows, right? I have all these things I'm playing around with, and this is how you become very confident in what you're doing, right? You just, oh, I have this idea, let me figure out how to do it. And really, there's probably no excuse to a certain extent why you cannot simulate a lot of the things that you're trying to do at the organization. Even like Workday, like I can go out and spin up a trial Workday account just to kind of get that Workday instance playground that I can play with. And then I have my dev Microsoft 365 tenant. And now if I want to simulate integration between the two, I can do that. Salesforce, I think, is the same way. You can get a very minimum, you can either do a trial version of Salesforce or a very minimum licensing model. It's going to cost money, but you're investing in your career. you're investing in your knowledge. You're investing in your career to either grow it where you are or as a launching pad to go somewhere else to where your skills will be much appreciated. Very long video. 27 minutes. This video could have been done at 17 minutes. The extra 10 was just icing on the cake. But either way, that's workflow pattern on how you can leverage Power Automate to do workflows. There's definitely a ton to unpack there. We're barely scratching the surface, even just in that single pattern. I'll see you tomorrow when we talk about how you can take Power Automate to another level with your pro dev skills.